Great to be with you and with Mark. Now, I'm going to tell you tonight some war stories about some extraordinary leaders I've been privileged to be with and learn from myself and hopefully pass some of it on to you. But before I do that, I want to tell you about another leader, perhaps a lesser leader than the ones I've encountered, but who was involved in something that was hugely consequential far from these shores, which could have made the entire world erupt. So let me take you to Moscow in Russia, the 25th of January, 1995. It's 9:28 in the morning, and the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, is handed a briefcase. And just on the side of the handle of the briefcase, a green light. And the briefcase is opened up for him, and it shows on the screen that about 4 minutes ago, a missile had been launched from somewhere in the region of the Norwegian Sea. And below this briefcase and the screen were a row of buttons. And if those buttons were pressed by Yeltsin, who had the authority to do it as the president of Russia, he would have scrambled every nuclear-armed Russian airplane, warship, and surface and land-to-air missile, which between them had 4,700 nuclear warheads on them. And elsewhere in Moscow, also with the briefcase, was General Kolesnikov, who was the chief of the Russian General Staff. And he too opened the briefcase and was monitoring the flight of this missile. And what he saw with the rocket was that it was falling away in stages, which suggested to him initially that this was a Mark II Pershing missile, exactly the same site or sort that had been deployed by the NATO forces in Western Europe. And they watched the trajectory, both of them separately, and they had a telephone, a hotline between them. And Yeltsin was told by the chief of the general staff that he had exactly 6 minutes in which to make a decision before this missile or rocket would land on Russian soil. And at that time, in January 1995, although the Cold War between the Soviet Union had ended and Russia itself had replaced the Soviet Union and America had signed or come to terms, there was enormous discontent in Moscow and Russia. There was huge unpopularity, which Yeltsin was experiencing. There was a lot of unhappiness in his general military staff over the dismemberment of the Soviet Empire. And so they thought, well, now NATO is expanding and it's coming for us. Within that 6-minute window, though, the general closed his briefcase and told the president to do the same, because they worked out that the rocket, whatever it was, could not reach the Russian mainland. In fact, what that rocket was a Norwegian weather missile that had been set off to go and look at the northern lights or the aurora borealis, which was happening at the same time. And that story, which is told in an extraordinary book published just a year or so ago by Peter Pry called War Scare, was, he said, the single most dangerous moment since nuclear weapons came to define the world in 1945. Now, of course, if that story had not had a happy ending, we wouldn't be here tonight, despite the enormous enthusiasm and positive energy of Mark Sham. But what that tells you, that story, is the dangers not just of mechanical failure or malfunction, but of miscommunication, of misunderstanding a signal when it's sent, even an image on a screen, because of fear, suspicion, prejudice, uncertainty, or simply a lack of knowledge or a lack of clarity. And what so impressed me when I met Mark and he came to speak to me and he showed me a video of a previous Suits and Sneakers event was not just how terribly uncool my children will think I am for looking like this. But what are you trying to do, they'll say. What do you think you are? Anyway, I'll find out when I go home. But was actually because what Suits and Sneakers is doing is what Mark told us about, which is to graft together the formal learning, the understanding, the technology with the informal, the suit and the sneaker. But I think in bringing us together tonight, Mark and Suits and Sneakers do something else. They lash together in these very uncertain times we find ourselves in times of fear, anxiety, of rising interest rates and the declining rand, of 3 cabinet ministers in finance in just 4 days. It reminds us actually that the best of South Africa happens when we lash together or put together our 2 most potent and entirely homegrown philosophies, Ubuntu on the one hand and 'n Boer maak 'n plan on the other hand. And I say that because when we did that in South Africa in the past, when we do it on evenings like this, we create a country which wins, a country at peace with itself, a country which goes forward and doesn't look backwards. And I am inspired by all of you being here tonight, not just because I'm an ex-politician, used to love audiences. We used to give people a bun and a Coke and a hat and a T-shirt to get them to come to our rallies. I don't know what got you here. Problem is the ANC always had far more T-shirts, far more Cokes, far more buns to give out in far more buses, so their rallies were always bigger than ours. But having spent 20 years, sometimes at the peak, more often in the pit of South African politics, as the leader of the opposition and other offices I held, is that I learned something from my favorite philosopher, Allen. Woody Allen, that is. Because Woody Allen said something you're going to experience tonight. He said 80% of life is about showing up. So I showed up at a critical stage in this country's politics, from apartheid to democracy and beyond, and I met 2 extraordinary men who changed our country. And because of those men and many other men and women and alongside and behind them, we meet here tonight in peaceful, if troubled, circumstances. And I'm going to talk about those 2 leaders and another leader that you've probably never heard of, but whose journey to where he is tonight is even more remarkable than the other 2. But when I was thinking, well, how do I bring this together? You know, you've got to have a theme, you've got to have a point, you've got to have precision. Scratching my head, you know, going back in time 22 years to tonight, from democracy when it began to where we are. I happened to read an article in the Financial Times by one of their ace correspondents called Philip Stevens, who had gone to Moscow to find out why Yeltsin's successor, President Vladimir Putin, was doing what he's doing. You know, invading the Crimea, taking it over, sending his warplanes to bomb Syria, then taking them out a few days ago out of Syria. What was all this aggression about? And when he went to Moscow, he met a very influential Russian who said to him, Putin is just reverting to the familiar, based on a very famous saying of ours, when you don't know what to do, you do what you know. When you don't know what you do what you know. And I discovered and had one of those aha moments, you know, the light bulb goes off in your head. And I realized what we did in South Africa to take this country from what it was, one of the most racially divided nations on the planet of the earth, one of the most internationally despised countries, heading towards a civil war of all against all. We stopped doing what we knew to do and started to do something else. Now, there's a very, very clever man called Professor Harry Hindsight. And he teaches at a university you unfortunately will never enter, called the University of Wise after the event. But only Professor Harry Hindsight in the University or Faculty of Wise after the event could have told you in the late 1980s, just when I was getting into politics and I was lecturing in law at Wits University, that apartheid was nearing its end. Because it didn't seem like it, and there was a huge amount of unrest, and something was going to change, but nobody knew when or what form the change would take. And I was lecturing at that university in the law faculty, and Wits was perhaps, I hope it still is, a center of excellence, particularly its law faculty. But it was a white institution. And that meant there were very few black students at Wits. Now, one student in one of my classes who stood out was a chap called Brian Mashili. And the reason why he stood out was because in a sea of white faces, he was black, and in a sea of clear and able-sighted people, he was blind. And he had a special braille machine which could convert his braille into plain text so his lecturers like me could read his essays and mark his exams. Now, there were people back then, black South Africans, who had both wealth and access, very few of them, but there were a few. But Brian did not come from such a magic circle. He came from a poor family in one of the poorest areas of Johannesburg, Alexandra Township, just a few kilometers from the splendid venue where we meet tonight. And his mother had died when he was 9 years old or 10 years old, and he lived in a house. He was the youngest of 6 children, without running water, without indoor plumbing, without electricity. And his father, who was a gold miner, was hundreds of kilometers away. And one night, 9 years before I met him in the Wits Law Faculty, Brian was out with some friends, a young boy, and he wore glasses, and Alexandra is one of the most violent areas in Johannesburg. He was attacked, and someone pushed a stick through his glasses and rendered him blind. And as Brian told the story later, if he had done the familiar thing of being a person who was poor, who was blind, who was black in those times, he probably would have gone onto the streets and become a beggar. Instead of which, in the teeth of the most difficult, adverse, extraordinary circumstances, he was sitting right in front of me as a law student at Wits University in 1988. And indeed, he graduated with an LLB. And I know the end of that story because 2 years ago, I was invited onto the radio station to have an on-air reunion with my former student, who was now the Honorable Mr. Justice Brian Mashili, appointed to the Gauteng High Court just months before. Now, I didn't just tell you that story, extraordinary though it is, inspiring and amazing for those times and place, and one individual's heroic effort happily rewarded, but because at the time, and the reason why someone like Brian being in a class that I was teaching was so unusual, was because we had a very conservative National Party Minister of Education who decreed that Wits University would be more or less exclusively reserved for whites, except in exceptional circumstances. And that conservative Minister of Education in 1988's name was F.W. de Klerk. And he was very conservative. And he came from a family that was even more conservative than he was at the time, because his uncle, J.G. Strydom, had been the Prime Minister of South Africa in the 1950s when apartheid or Baaskap was at its height. And interestingly enough, just today, F.W. de Klerk gave a speech where he said, my uncle J.G. Strydom was an unapologetic white supremacist. Probably would have felt at home in Mr. Donald Trump's Republican Party tonight. Better not say that. Might be attacking the leader of the free world, in a few months' time. And F.W. de Klerk was the Conservative Minister of Education. And the following year, I left Brian and his fellow students at Wits when I was elected to the same parliament which elected F.W. de Klerk, the President of South Africa, at the end of 1989. And I was on the other side of the aisle from F.W. de Klerk. I've always been on the other side of the aisle from whoever's in power, but anyway, nothing seems to change, despite the change of power. And my party, the Democratic Party, didn't like anything that F.W. de Klerk stood for. And when we arrived in Parliament on the 2nd of February 1990, for the first day, the opening of Parliament, now called the State of the Nation, we simply expected F.W. de Klerk to do what his 5 predecessors, National Party prime ministers and presidents, all had done. That he would do what he knew to do, and that is not make the necessary change to turn South Africa into an inclusive democracy based on majority rule and a constitutional settlement between all South Africans on the basis of equality. And yet de Klerk, in 40 minutes, this prince of privilege of the National Party, turned 350 years of South African history on its head. And that speech, which unbanned the ANC, which agreed to constitutional negotiations, was of such thermonuclear intensity that even today, 26 years later, we are still feeling its after effects, for better and for some people for worse. And de Klerk was different from his predecessors because each of them had read the same writing on the wall, but each of them assumed it was addressed for someone else. De Klerk knew that the writing was looking at him. And as he said many years later, I was advised by many people in my security cluster to hang in and just tough it out. But I knew that was the way to disaster and to long-term ruin for the country. And so we made the change. Now, de Klerk was not a perfect politician or human being. Very few of us are. But he had the courage to see that change had to happen and that he couldn't defer it to someone else or the next generation or the next person. And of all the consequential decisions he made that day and announcements that he wrung out, the most important was saved for the end. That in 9 days' time, on the 11th of February 1990, the world's most famous political prisoner, Nelson Mandela, would be released as a free man into a South Africa not yet free. Now, I don't want to sound like Spike Milligan, looking at the audience age tonight with 1 or 2 exceptions. No one's heard of Spike Milligan. Well, Spike Milligan was a famous British comedian who wrote a book called Hitler, My Role in His Downfall. And he was only a corporal in the British Army during that war. So it was a fun title. I wrote a book called Opposite Mandela. You can buy it outside. I wasn't quite a foot soldier, but I was the head of an opposition party to the great Nelson Mandela. The most difficult job in 21st century or 20th century South Africa. How do you oppose a living legend? Well, if you don't agree with everything he stands for and you want a constitutional democracy, you've got to be in opposition. But there are 3 things about Mandela it is so important to grasp. Firstly, although he might have been canonized subsequently, he was not a saint. He was a certifiable, fallible human being. And that made the things he did, the forgiveness he had and the achievements he etched, all the more remarkable because they came from human rather than divine source. The second thing is that Mandela spent a lot of his time after he got out of jail, and certainly a lot of time in jail, doing what he knew to do. And that was to be the most powerful, the most authentic, the most authoritative voice for his political movement, the African National Congress. If you're a powerful leader of a huge, powerful organization as the ANC became after he was freed, and arguably even before, that's what you've got to do. You've got to stand up for your party and you've got to defend it. But in many other ways, Mandela did what he didn't know to do until he had to do it. And that was to do what wasn't expected. And so, if I go back to the 1980s, Brian Mashili at university, I lecturing there, I need to make a further confession and tell you that I was born and grew up in Durban. Well, no one's perfect, but there you are. And in the 1980s, in that time, when change was coming to South Africa, but as I said, no one knew when, how, or in what form, peaceful, warlike, there was actually a civil war going on in what was called the province of Natal then, between the supporters of Mandela's movement and the supporters of Mangosuthu Buthelezis Inkatha movement. And it was so intense that 20,000 people nearly were killed in that violence in the 10 years leading to the democratic era in South Africa in 1994. And so when this finally first election arrives in South Africa in 1994, no province in South Africa was more hotly, heavily, and ferociously contested than Natal, which became KZN afterward. And Mandela, who extraordinarily went to cast his first vote as an adult at the ripe old age of 76, chose to go to Ananda in KwaZulu-Natal to make his mark, to show it was safe to vote. And everyone knew in 1994, and I was there, so I knew it, and I was on a small party called the Democratic Party side, that the outcome of the election was a certainty. The ANC would win. It had all the claims of liberation, history, and justice on its side. But the big uncertainty was what would happen in Natal and the Western Cape, where de Klerk's party was expected to win. And you know, today in South Africa, you're going to do it next month, hopefully, with some passion or around a braai, whatever we do on public holidays. We celebrate the 27th of April as Freedom Day. Correct, first election, free. But if you actually go back, and if you were old enough and ugly enough to have been there at the time, it was anything but freedom assured on the 27th of April 94. Bombs were going off at what was called Jan Smuts, now OR Tambo Airport, and in the Joburg city centre. There were widespread irregularities, malpractices, and in this hotly contested province of Natal, the ANC was convinced, as the days and days went by between the voting ending and the counting, which never seemed to end, that they had been robbed of a famous victory. There were pirate voting stations, stuffing of ballots. The Amakosi had taken control of things from the IEC. There were a lot of bad stuff going on. And in the middle of this long, long waiting process to know the results of the election, an urgent meeting was called of the ANC High Command, National Executive in Shell House, now Luthuli House. And an eyewitness to that meeting described it very well, because a lot of the ANC people from KwaZulu-Natal were saying, this election's a farce, we must denounce it, it wasn't free and fair. And Mandela listened to all these voices, and then, as his pollster Stanley Greenberg said, he brought the room to a full stop. He said, we will do nothing as the ANC to denounce the election. We will say nothing other than it was free and fair. You go and tell the comrades in Natal and tell the comrades in the Western Cape to be prepared to lose. Because Mandela realized even in the weeks before he became president of an uncertain, expectant, and very anxious country, that sometimes the president has duties to the country which transcend the party, which go beyond the immediacy of gratification, as Azania was telling us earlier on, to something that is more necessary for the long-term health of the people who live under your democracy. And so he ceded control in 2 provinces, even though some thought that his party had won one of them. And he did that again and again in his presidency. And I don't have enough time under the restrictions we're imposed on here. And I mean, Mark gave the longest introduction I've ever heard. To tell you anything other than another book, another story about the same Mandela. But it's so human, and it's so true, and it's so revealing. And sometimes I just wish that we could have a bit of that today, and a bit less of what we have today, and had put it in the past. But there it is. So I'm now the leader of the Democratic Party. It's November 1998. We're gearing up for an election campaign the following year. And Mandela, who was immensely warm and well-disposed towards me and always calling me up and asking me around, it's all in my book, Opposite Mandela, available outside at a discounted price, I'm told. You know, you've got to put in a commercial. And he was enormously, expansively inclusive. But, you know, I do my day job, which was not to support the ANC. And he had to do his. And once he got so irritated with me, he said, you know that Tony Leon and the Democratic Party, they're just a Mickey Mouse organization. So I was a bit, you know, kind of ticked off. The word I used at the time was not ticked, but anyway, I'm family gathering this. And I immediately responded, well, if I'm in charge of a Mickey Mouse organization, the president heads a goofy government. See how Disney-esque and adult our political dialogue was down then. We didn't have Julius Malema to make it more mature then. Anyway, so, you know, those were the terms of trade. A few weeks later, unfortunately, unexpectedly, I just found myself very nervously at the Mill Park Hospital near here, about to undergo a coronary bypass operation. And my wife said, well, at least to prove to people you do have a heart. But I was very nervous. Anyway, it's the night before the operation, and there's a knock on the door. And this world-famous voice outside the door says, oh, hello, is Mickey Mouse inside? It's Goofy, I'd like to come and wish you well. And then walked Mandela. And as you can see, that speeded me to a recovery, and I'm happily here today. But there was the extraordinary humanity, the warmth, the power of the gesture that you would have experienced yourselves, even if you didn't experience it directly. And so what I'm trying to say to you with the story of this visionary Mandela, the sightless Brian Mashili, now judge, F.W. de Klerk, once politically blind, tomorrow in Cape Town, the 18th of March, I'm going to his 80th birthday. We were formerly adversaries, but today I acknowledge what he did to help get us to where we are. And in 2009, after 20 years of this intensity of South African politics, I also knew I couldn't keep doing what I knew what to do, and I'd do something else. Wasn't sure what it was. And I need to hand over my organization, the Democratic Alliance, to other people, to fresher faces, to newer voices to take it forward. And so I stood down. As I said on the video, you know, always jump before you get pushed, because I would have been pushed if I hadn't jumped. And the man who might yet get pushed because he hasn't got jumped, Jacob Zuma, got hold of me a few months later and said, well, you know, would I be prepared to be ambassador of South Africa and Argentina? And I thought about this, and I thought, you know, I could do what I keep knowing to do, which is to be in party politics. Or I could do something which I don't know what to do, which is to put my country first ahead of party and go and represent it. in the extraordinary region of South America to where I was sent, which itself was crippled by a populist president who eventually gave up office in December and has been replaced by someone else who I think will renew, refresh, and reinvigorate that once great country. So I went and did something else, represented a country, not a party. But you know, in preparation and while I was there, I read all the time, as I always read. You can always learn something new, and I was reading about something I didn't know anything about. And I came across this giant of South American literature, the novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez was famous because he introduced, or at least popularized, something called magical realism. Tales of wonder and extraordinary, almost supernatural things. And as I was reading up on South America through the extraordinary imaginative eyes of Garcia Marquez, I realized something extraordinary had happened in my own country across the South Atlantic, South Africa, 22 years ago. And more often than not, we take it for granted. But I realized tonight, before you now, that we can't just be a golden footnote in history. And you and your lives can't just be remembered for the one big thing you got right. Because every great project, personal, commercial, political, national, needs to be renewed, it needs to be refreshed, it needs to be reinvigorated. And so do not succumb in whatever it is, your own family, your business, your country, to just going along to get along. You've got to do what those three extraordinary individuals I described and countless others whom I've never met, that you take a leap onto the other side, into the unknown, into doing something that's right, which might not immediately help you, because ultimately it's going to pay off and it's the better thing to do. And you do that with all the imperfections that go with it, because we're all human, we all have to do the short-term cuts and everything else and do the selfish things, but sometimes you have that great moment and you can seize it in whatever it is. And that's what South Africa's got to do. And 2 years ago, when Gabriel Garcia Marquez died at a great age, in his obituary was one of his most famous paragraphs, where he said, "It is not true that people stop pursuing dreams because they grow old. They grow old because they stop pursuing dreams." So stay forever young. Thank you very much.